What you are about to read is not simply a story about a tense diplomatic meeting. It is a dramatic reimagining of a moment that, in this telling, shakes the foundations of the modern Western alliance. At its center are two of the most polarizing figures in contemporary politics, Donald Trump and Ursula von der Leyen. According to this account, behind the heavy doors of the Oval Office, a confrontation unfolded that could redefine the relationship between the United States and Europe for a generation. For more than 75 years, the transatlantic alliance has been one of the central pillars of global stability. From the ashes of World War II emerged a new order built on American security guarantees and European economic reconstruction. The United States stationed troops across the continent, invested billions through reconstruction programs, and embedded itself deeply in Europe's defense architecture through NATO. In return, Europe aligned strategically with Washington during the Cold War and beyond. But alliances are not static, they evolve, and in this narrative, they fracture. When von der Leyen boarded her flight to Washington, she carried briefing books thick with proposals, trade adjustments, defense spending pathways, climate cooperation frameworks. She was no novice, a former German defense minister and seasoned political operator. She had navigated crises ranging from Brexit to the pandemic to war on Europe's eastern flank. She believed she understood the man she was about to meet. Trump, freshly returned to power with renewed political momentum, had long argued that the United States had borne a disproportionate share of the Western alliance's costs. For decades, he had criticized trade imbalances, NATO burden-sharing gaps, and what he described as regulatory discrimination against American companies. To his supporters, he was finally prepared to settle accounts. The atmosphere in the Oval Office, according to this dramatic retelling, was stark. No extended pleasantries, no warm diplomatic choreography. Trump began not with anecdotes, but with figures. He described what he called a sweeping audit of the U.S.-Europe relationship: trade flows, defense expenditures, tariff structures, regulatory disputes. He pointed to cumulative trade deficits running into the hundreds of billions. He cited decades of American military spending in Europe following the Cold War: aircraft carriers in the Mediterranean, air bases in Germany, rotational deployments in Eastern Europe. In Trump's framing, the numbers told a story of imbalance. In Europe's framing, those same numbers reflected interdependence: American companies profiting from access to one of the world's largest markets, U.S. strategic influence anchored through European alliances, and shared prosperity built over decades. But the meeting, as imagined here, was not about reconciling narratives, it was about demands. First came a retroactive defense cost reimbursement proposal, an eye-watering figure presented as compensation for decades of what Trump characterized as disproportionate American sacrifice. Von der Leyen, stunned, reportedly asked how such a sum could realistically be raised. Trump's answer, blunt and unapologetic: that was Europe's problem. Second came energy. Trump demanded that Europe dismantle major components of its green transition framework and pivot heavily towards American natural gas exports. For von der Leyen, whose political legacy is intertwined with the European Green Deal, this was more than economic pressure, it was ideological confrontation. Third, Trump proposed allowing individual European nations to negotiate bilateral trade agreements with Washington rather than dealing exclusively through Brussels. Such a shift would strike at the institutional heart of the European project, which rests on collective bargaining power. The unity of the European Union depends on member states subordinating certain national preferences to common policy. Bilateral fragmentation would test that principle severely. Fourth, he demanded that every European nation raise military spending to 5% of GDP, far beyond the long-debated 2% NATO guideline. For heavily indebted countries, such a target would require painful domestic trade-offs: social services, pensions, education budgets. Fifth, he called for European regulators to halt investigations into major American technology firms and redirect scrutiny towards European and Chinese competitors. In Brussels, regulatory authority has long been viewed as a sovereign tool to shape digital markets.
Redirecting that authority at Washington's request would be politically explosive. Finally, there was a deadline: 30 days. In this narrative, Trump paired the ultimatum with threats of sweeping tariffs under Section 232 authority, punitive duties on automobiles, luxury goods, and agricultural exports. Such measures would severely disrupt transatlantic trade flows. Von der Leyen returned to Brussels shaken. Emergency meetings convened, finance ministers ran projections, defense officials recalculated budgets, political leaders quietly assessed the risks of unity versus national survival. Would Germany protect its automakers through a side deal? Would France secure carve-outs for wine and agriculture? Would Italy, burdened by debt, seek relief through bilateral concessions? The story suggests that even before the meeting, certain European leaders had discreetly reached out to Trump's team, probing possibilities for preferential arrangements. If true, that alone would signal cracks in the facade of European solidarity. Markets reacted violently in this telling. The euro wavered, stock exchanges trembled. Analysts debated whether the post-1945 Western Alliance, arguably the most successful geopolitical partnership in modern history, was entering its final chapter. Yet beneath the drama lies a deeper structural tension. The United States and Europe are bound by more than trade balances and defense budgets. They share intelligence networks, supply chains, research ecosystems, and cultural ties that are difficult to unravel overnight. American companies invest heavily in Europe. European firms employ millions of American workers. NATO's integrated command structure is woven tightly through decades of operational planning. And yet, politics is not governed solely by institutional inertia. It is driven by domestic pressures. American voters concerned about manufacturing decline, European citizens anxious about sovereignty, energy costs, and security threats. Leaders on both sides facing electoral realities that reward confrontation more than compromise. Trump's gamble in this portrayal is that Europe will ultimately prioritize national economic survival over supranational unity. Faced with crippling tariffs and financial shock, individual governments might break ranks. If even a few do, the cohesion of the European Union could weaken dramatically. Von der Leyen's gamble is different. She must convince 27 member states that solidarity remains their strongest defense. If Europe stands together, it retains leverage as one of the world's largest economic blocs. If it fractures, Washington's bargaining power multiplies. The next 30 days become a countdown not just to a policy decision, but to a potential geopolitical turning point. Will Europe assemble the funds demanded? Will it accelerate defense spending in a show of seriousness? Will it double down on climate policy as an assertion of autonomy? Or will pragmatism override principle? History offers precedent for tension within alliances: the Suez Crisis, disputes over Iraq, trade wars over steel and agriculture, and yet the transatlantic bond has endured, reshaped but intact. This imagined confrontation dramatizes a question that has simmered beneath the surface for years. Is the Western Alliance a permanent feature of global politics or a contingent arrangement subject to the pressures of national interest? As emergency meetings continue in Brussels and policy teams draft contingency plans in Washington, the world watches. Investors, diplomats, military planners all understand that a rupture between the United States and Europe would reverberate far beyond tariffs and defense budgets. It would reshape global power balances, embolden rivals, and unsettle decades of predictability. The 30-day clock ticks. If compromise emerges, it could mark a recalibration of burden sharing and regulatory alignment. If not, the consequences could be historic: a reordering of alliances, a fragmentation of institutions, and a new era defined less by Western unity and more by competitive blocs. In the end, the confrontation between Donald Trump and Ursula von der Leyen, whether remembered as brinkmanship or breakthrough, symbolizes something larger. It is a test of whether shared history outweighs present grievance, whether institutions built after catastrophe can withstand populist pressure, whether unity forged in crisis can survive prosperity's complacency. The outcome will not be decided by rhetoric alone. It will hinge on budgets, ballots, negotiations, and the quiet calculations of leaders weighing domestic politics against global responsibility. And as the deadline approaches, one question echoes across capitals on both sides of the Atlantic. Is this a momentary shock to the system or the beginning of a fundamental realignment of the Western world?